Well, it is draft season, everybody, and for the Buffalo Bills, it has become that much more interesting after the Stefon Diggs trade, so we thought it was the perfect time to get Chris Trapasso from CBS Sports, one of their draft experts. I actually originally reached out to Chris the day the Bills traded Stefon Diggs, so we kind of pushed it aside for a couple days, but here we are. Chris, thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
No, thanks for having me. And yes, it is definitely more exciting to talk about the Bills. And we've discussed so much about wide receiver, but kind of thought maybe it's first round, maybe it's second round. They have some weapons in the room. Suddenly that room is pretty bare outside of Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel. So plenty of justified receiver talk to get to now with the Bills.
Okay, so I think let's start at the top and let's kind of work our way down. We know that there's a big three. We've all heard about the big three, and forever it felt like it was impossible to even have that conversation. But now I think a lot of people are warming up to the idea of potentially kind of trading the house and moving up in the draft. Let me first ask you, would it be worth it? How good are these three guys?
Malik Neighbors, if somehow he is still available, and this is the wide receiver from LSU, like at pick 6 to pick 10, I'm not a big advocate of trading up, especially in such a deep wide receiver class, but he would be worth trading up for. I think he checks every single box out of a number one wide receiver today. He's relatively young. The yards after the catch ability is, I think, as good as I've ever seen out of a wide receiver prospect. It can also get down the field, track it very well. The only real negative to his game is that in the SEC, he didn't have to run a variety of routes to get open. He was just more athletic than all of those SEC defensive backs, many of which will get drafted. So I think Neighbors is certainly worth it. And just that entire big three, Marvin Harrison Jr. from Ohio State and even Rome Odunze from Washington, they are really that good. I think, though, after Neighbors, I don't want to say it wouldn't be worth it, but I would be less enthused if the Bills traded up, and would have to trade a lot to do it, to get either Marvin Harrison Jr. or Rome Odunze.
Okay, so basically, I don't want to mince your words here. So it would be worth it for Marvin Harrison Jr. It would definitely be worth it for Malik Neighbors. How about Odunze? Would it be worth it for him, or is there a little drop-off with how you rank them as 1, 2, and then maybe a little gap to 3?
Yeah, there's definitely a gap between those two. So, I mean, you have to look at it, and I'm sure Brandon Beane is thinking about it this way too. For Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, you probably have to trade from somewhere to from pick 4 to pick 7 or 8. Rome Odunze might be available at pick 9 with the Bears, at pick 11 with the Vikings, so you wouldn't have to give up as much to get him. And I think that is kind of aligned with how I view these prospects. I actually love Brian Thomas Jr., which I'm sure we're going to talk about as well, Malik Neighbors' teammate from LSU. But I think the fact that Odunze would probably be available later, wouldn't cost as much, that's probably about right, because he's not quite the separator that Marvin Harrison Jr. and certainly not the separator that Malik Neighbors is. So I think everything beyond that, yards after the catch, contested catch ability is through the roof. He's just a little bit less of a prospect, but still would be like the number one receiver off the board in most other drafts.
Yeah, it's funny because, I was at the Combine and I was having all these different conversations, and the player you just mentioned, Brian Thomas Jr., somebody told me, hey, any other year, this would be the number one guy. He is that good. So I think that might be the most attainable. Even though that would probably require a trade up, it wouldn't be okay, we're completely mortgaging our future for a wide receiver. So how good is Brian Thomas Jr.?
Well, he kind of gives you everything that all the other top big three wide receivers give you, that he's 6'2", 210 pounds. His contested catch rate was very close to Rome Odunze, who was the best in the class, but he can really win above his head in traffic with good regularity. The fluidity running routes, I think, is very good for being a bigger bodied wide receiver. He caught 17 touchdowns last year. Some were just deep down the field with that low 4.3 speed. Some were a 15-yard dig route where he stiff-armed a safety, made another defender miss, and then kind of just tranced into the end zone. So he really brings you that complete skill set. Now, you only saw it for 1 year, the mega production from Brian Thomas Jr., but if he's available somewhere in the teens, and like you're saying, Matt, wouldn't cost the Bills a ton to move up to get him, I think he would be another one that would be worth it if they want to plug him into this offense now and ask him to eventually be that unquestioned wide receiver 1 in this offense.
Okay, now let's go to the Texas guys, because there's a pair there who I know a lot of people are talking about. Start with A.D. Mitchell. What do you think of him? Because I know that before the Diggs trade, he was a guy that was very often connected to the Bills. What do you think of him? And then also Worthy.
From a size and speed perspective, very similar to Brian Thomas. They almost have identical height, weight, length, and speed that they showed at the combine. They're both under 4.35 in terms of their speed, and that is really fast at that size. The question that I have with A.D. Mitchell is, I wonder why he wasn't more productive when he started his career at Georgia and then transferred to Texas. That's not to say that he was not productive, but being that big, that fast, and as fluid as he is running routes, would have expected him to be a 1,000-yard receiver, 10-plus touchdowns, and that really was not the case. The other big concern that I have with A.D. Mitchell, and I still like him a lot, he's a low or an early second-round grade for me. The yards after the catch ability just was not there at Texas. He caught a lot of passes, would go down. He was not bouncing off tacklers, making guys miss. Brian Thomas gives you that. Romo Dunze, to a certain degree, gives you that. All the other kind of premier prospects in this class give you that. Now with Xavier Worthy, you get 4.21 speed. So like that is something that is just at the top of his draft resume. And I like that at around 6 foot and 165 pounds, he will lower his shoulder and stay upright after taking a big hit, whether it's an Alabama defender or someone in the Big 12. He did that relatively often at Texas. The routes are pretty good too. He kind of reminds me of a better version of Marquise Brown, who was a late first-round pick in 2019. So different flavors, but you certainly get a lot of vertical, kind of take the lid off the defense speed with both of those Texas receivers.
What other receivers do you think would be worth it in the first round? I know you said A.D. Mitchell for you has a high second-round grade, but, I mean, I'm looking at the list. There's Ladd McConkey. There's Xavier Legette. There's Javon Baker. Like, there's so many names. Troy Franklin, Keon Goldman, all these guys. What other person would make sense for the Bills in your mind?
Ladd McConkey, if they just stay put at 28 and Brandon Beane can kind of fight off that desire that he's had so often in the first round to trade up to get his guy, they could probably pick Ladd McConkey there at 28. And I think he's someone that is not the classic underneath slot receiver. He's not Cole Beasley. He's not Hunter Renfrow. He won the majority of his time on the outside at Georgia. Over 70% of his routes came as a perimeter wide receiver. He ran 4.39 at the combine. And in terms of the route running ability that I think maybe is lacking to a certain degree with Malik Nabers just because he's so explosive, McConkey has that. And that comes from just pure speed that he can threaten with down the field and the route running nuance that we've seen with Stephon Diggs, the shoulder fakes, the changing speeds, head fakes, selling a post, and then going to the corner. He is maybe the best in this entire class at just getting open. And we know the Bills have really prioritized that in the past. So Ladd McConkey at 28. I love Javon Baker from UCF. I think he would be worth it at 28. But that is where you kind of have to go into, do the Bills feel like they could maybe get him later at pick 60 or maybe after a trade up into the second round? That's probably where he's ultimately going to go. But in terms of just overall skill set, I think Javon Baker from UCF, who started at Alabama, gives you that kind of complete skill set that Ladd McConkey does, but just in a bigger frame.
And then the only other guy that I don't think we've talked about that I have on my list here, Xavier Legette. I know that he was somebody who has kind of rised up draft boards, at least from the outside looking in. How do you feel about him?
I'm a little lower on him, and it's kind of how I feel about A.D. Mitchell. Not that I think that you need to have 4 years of elite production, but before 2023, Xavier Legette had a little over 400 yards receiving in his South Carolina career. Then he goes over 1,000 yards as a 23-year-old. And I think it's easy to draw the comparisons to Deebo Samuel, same school, similar body types. But if you look at the numbers, he wasn't forcing as many missed tackles as Deebo Samuel did. I think he has that ability to maybe be a good contested catch and a yards after the catch type player because he is 6'1" and 220 pounds with good leaping ability, a lot of explosion in his lower half. I just didn't see it as much as I think people are kind of projecting just watching his entire 2023 film at South Carolina. But being 6'1" and 220, running sub 4.4, having a 40-inch vertical, he really ticks a lot of the boxes if you look back historically for a wide receiver who goes in the first round.
We just talked about a lot of names, and I know that you've got a lot kind of in the Rolodex there. Who makes the most sense for you for the Bills? If you were Brandon Beane for the day, what would you do?
If I had to trade up, I would go Brian Thomas Jr. because there's a few reasons here and a lot we've already talked about. They probably wouldn't have to trade into the top 10 for him. Could probably get him from somewhere pick 12 to pick 17 in that range. Would not cost an arm and a leg. And like I mentioned, I think Brian Thomas Jr. would give you that well-rounded skill set. You want size. Brandon Beane spoke to that at the owners' meeting, he spoke to the fact that the Bills wanted more yards after the catch ability. That was something that has really been lacking in this offense the last couple of years. You get that with Brian Thomas and low 4.3 speed. You get that with Brian Thomas. So if I had to trade up, I would pick him just because of the cost and the skill set. Staying put, I think I would go with Ladd McConkey. He really feels like that modern day wide receiver at 5'11", almost 6 foot, 185 pounds, not too small. We've seen Tank Dell, Deontay Johnson, Jordan Addison, a lot of receivers lately that are under 190 pounds that just get open all the time. And that's what Ladd McConkey does. I love that he brings you that element of the 4.39 speed. The drop rate is not really a concern. He just feels like a player who's been in a lot of big games, produced in a lot of big games, and I think could acclimate very quickly to this Bills offense and win on the outside. That's really what they need after trading Stephon Diggs.
I'm in a fantasy football league with a guy whose name is Jeff Conkey, and he really wants the Bills to take McConkey because it's so close, and that would be his new favorite player. Is there anybody else that we didn't specifically talk about on the more higher ends that you think the Bills should be considering? I know Troy Franklin's a name I see out there. Keon Coleman's a name out there. Anybody like that?
Yeah, I like Troy Franklin from Oregon quite a bit. I thought he was going to run a little faster at the combine, ran it in the high 4.4s. Seems faster on film, and I like that he has some flexibility to his game. He kind of reminds me of, I don't think he's as good as Justin Jefferson, but the way he moves on the field reminds me of him. So if the Bills love him and want to pick him at 28 or trade back early in the second, or maybe even hope to get him at 60, I would be okay with that. One other name, maybe later, maybe in the fourth round, if they do double dip now with a glaring need at wide receiver, Jamari Thrash from Louisville. Kind of gave me truly Stephon Diggs vibes on film. Similar size, maybe a little bit lighter than Diggs was coming out of Maryland, but one on the outside. I think that's important. The routes are there. The downfield ability is there, and he's really good after the catch. You watch him, and you think he's just going to go down on first contact because he is kind of skinny, but at Louisville, multiple years of high-level production, bounces off tacklers, good cutting skill, and good route running ability. So Jamari Thrash is a name to kind of keep in the back of your mind, again, if the Bills want to double dip in this draft.
My last wide receiver question for you. How good is the class? It feels like now that they've traded Stephon Diggs, we're talking about it even more. But we were talking about it even before that happened. So how good is this wide receiver class?
It's really good. I do think we've gotten to the point where it's a little overrated because everyone's been talking about it and kind of labeling it as this all-time class. And here's what I mean by that. I think if you need a niche type, if you want just a downfield guy that's not going to get open very much, you can pick Devontae Walker from North Carolina or Brendan Rice, Jerry Rice's son, from USC. If you want a slot guy, there's Malik Washington from Virginia, Anaya Smith from Texas A&M, Taj Washington from USC. In terms of like future number ones, which I think we all agree that's what the Bills are looking for, there's the big three. You can throw in Brian Thomas and make it a big four, and those are all going to be probably gone in the first or top half of the first round. After that, I don't think there's an immense depth at like future 150 target type wide receiver like we've seen in the past in the second and the third round. I love Javon Baker. I think Jamari Thrash has a little bit of that ability, but there's more niche types later in the draft as opposed to, hey, this guy's maybe a little slower, but he has a complete skill set. There's not a ton of those in this draft class. A lot of more role-specific types that will be picked third round, fourth round, and later than that.
I know there might be some pitchforks grabbed if they don't take a receiver in the first round, but the other positions that I kind of have crossed on my or written on my list here, defensive tackle and edge. Mm-hmm. The names that I've heard you talk about, that I've talked about at the Combine, Chop Robinson and Johnny Newton. Can you start with Chop Robinson? Would he make sense for the Bills, given the similarity in body type to Von Miller?
Absolutely. And I think that has been something that's missing on this Bills defensive line. Although it's been very good, but we've seen it not really have its biggest performances in those key games in the playoffs. Having someone that can win around the corner in a flash, and that in his prime, and then even in 2022 pre-injury, that's where Von Miller made his mark in the NFL and why he's going to be a Hall of Famer. I'm not going to say that Chop Robinson is the next Von Miller, but he is my number one edge rusher in this class because of that ability, that he does not have an amazing toolbox of pass rush moves right now. I mean, he shows them occasionally, but you would like him to be a little better, and I think that's why a lot of mock drafts have him in the 20s or maybe even later or even in the early second. But the bend, burst, dip around the corner is absolutely elite. I think he would be a great addition to this Bills team, because after him and a few others in the first round, I don't love the depth at the edge rusher position later.
And then who is your favorite defensive tackle if for some reason that is what they do? If they stay put at 28,
Sure.
Is there anybody who you really like?
Yeah, Byron Murphy from Texas, I think, is just the complete up-the-field pass rusher, and that's something else that I think inside the Bills have kind of missed. They have, of course, Ed Oliver, who had a breakout season in 2023, didn't really show up in that divisional round loss to the Chiefs, but he's really the only up-the-field explosive pass rusher on the interior of this defensive line. Byron Murphy, you mentioned Johnny Newton from Illinois. He's a similar type. And don't sleep on Braden Fisk from Florida State, who has really short arms, but beyond that, he would be a top 20 pick really in any draft. Elite explosiveness, super productive at Florida State. He, I think, maybe even tested himself into the back end of the first round. He's someone that, with Sean McDermott, how much he loves to rotate up front along the defensive line and how much they've addressed that position. I wouldn't be surprised if any of those three were strongly considered for the Bills, even after the hole that was created by the Stephon Diggs trade.
Chris, you are the perfect person to ask this last question to because you spend hours and hours and hours researching the draft, and you live here in Buffalo. This will be a successful draft for the Bills if. Finish that sentence.
If they get someone who can be a future number one wide receiver. Now, I will say I don't think that it needs to be as wide receiver one centric, and that is the Bills offense like it was under Stephon Diggs. We saw it from week 10 on under Joe Brady that spread the football around. That was kind of the theme. Dalton Kincaid would have a big game, then Khalil Shakir, then it'd be a James Cook running game. I do think the Bills want to truly ask Josh Allen to be more of a point guard and not just lean into one wide receiver. But I think when you're scheming to stop the Bills defensively, to have that guy who can get open and can really be that 8-catch, 130-yard, one-touchdown player in a key game that they certainly had over the last 4 years with Stephon Diggs beyond the last half of 2023, that is huge. So if they find a future wide receiver one who they can lean on in crunch time or in critical situations or the playoffs, I think it will be a successful draft.
All right, that is Chris Trapasso. Chris, tell everybody where they can follow, read your work, hear you as we get ready for these next crazy couple weeks.
Yeah, CBS Sports. I will be during the draft starting on day 2. I run the real-time draft grades. So from pick 33 all the way to, I don't even know what it is, 258, 256. Every pick that comes in, I'll give a few sentences on the player, on the fit, and give it a grade. I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of comments on those real-time grades, but that's where you can find me, CBS Sports Draft Tracker, starting with the second round of the draft on Friday.
You just got to pander. Give everybody like a B or an A, and then everybody's going to love you even more. Exactly. That is Chris Trapasso. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.